Greetings. I would like to welcome you to the CHCI session on gun violence, El Paso, a year later. My name is Yvette Maldonado, and I've been the Human Resources Director at CHCI for the past year. Having 4 boys in school, this conversation is of personal importance. On behalf of CHCI, I would like to thank Everytown for Gun Safety, Giffords, and Brady for their generous support of this session. Before we begin our session, I would like to introduce our panel host, the Honorable Veronica Escobar, and our panel moderator, Dr. Sylvia Costa. Congresswoman Escobar represents Texas' 16th Congressional District in El Paso. She took office on January 3, 2019 as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives after making history as the first woman elected to this seat and the first of 2 Latinas from Texas to serve in Congress. As a third-generation El Pasoan, Congresswoman Escobar has dedicated her life's work to improving the lives of the people of El Paso. Congresswoman Escobar serves on the House Armed Services Committee and the Judiciary Committee. In addition, she is a freshman representative for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. On July 31st of this year, she introduced H.R. 1075, commemorating 1 year since the domestic terror attack motivated by white supremacy occurred in El Paso, Texas on August 3, 2019. She also introduced H.R. 7908 to designate the El Paso Community Healing Garden National Memorial in El Paso. This panel will bring together representatives from the nonprofit sector to discuss the work of El Paso's leaders and advocates and their response to the heinous attack on their community. To help us moderate this important and timely session, we are thrilled to have Dr. Sylvia Costa, CEO of the YWCA El Paso del Norte region. Dr. Acosta oversees the largest YWCA in the nation with over 400 employees and a budget of over $28 million. Her organization works to improve lives and provide for the public well-being. In the fall of 2019, Dr. Acosta, who has over 25 years of management experience in the nonprofit sector, was asked to testify in front of Congress. She provided critically important testimony on how the tax code subsidized hate. She testified that the loss of life in El Paso was a direct result of hate speech, making the important point that those types of organizations should not receive the same tax-exempt status as nonprofits who strive to serve their fellow citizens. This issue is an important one for our country. Thank you for joining us for this dynamic panel discussion. And don't forget to continue the conversation via social media using hashtag CHCIHHM20.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, and I am so proud to represent Texas' 16th Congressional District. It is a privilege to join CHCI's Leadership Conference for this very important discussion. On August 3rd, 2019, El Paso, my safe and secure border community, was shocked and heartbroken by an act of domestic terrorism that devastated all of us. A shooter motivated by hate and racism drove over 600 miles, killed 23 people, wounded 22, and changed our lives forever. El Paso and communities across the nation have the right to live free from fear. The violence caused by this attack inflicted trauma and pain that our community still feels today. It is violence that is unfortunately far too common in our country. It is violence that is absolutely unacceptable. Our country desperately needs and demands change. The overwhelming majority of the American people support universal background checks. In fact, a year after the massacre, 47% of Latino voters believe we should have stronger gun laws. We can't continue to fail the victims, survivors, and thousands of communities like El Paso impacted by gun violence. Our nation's leaders have the responsibility to lead with the courage to protect our communities and act to end the gun violence epidemic in our country. This year has been painful for El Paso, especially for the survivors and the loved ones of those who were killed. But as we grieve and heal together, we will continue to combat hate with love, and we will confront xenophobia in the same way we always have, by welcoming the stranger and treating every human being with dignity and respect. Today, To discuss what we can all do to stop racism and end gun violence, you will hear from Everytown, Giffords, and Brady, three amazing organizations leading the way for change. You'll also hear from the YWCA of El Paso, which has played a critical role in healing and empowerment of El Pasoans. We all have a role to play, and I hope this conversation inspires you to demand action.
Thank you, Congresswoman Escobar, for your passion, commitment, and leadership in our community and Congress. My name is Dr. Sylvia Costa, and I am the CEO of YWCA El Paso del Norte region. For those of you that may not know, the YWCA's mission is to eliminate racism, empower women, and promote peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. YWCA and our 200 plus affiliates is the oldest racial justice organization in the United States run by women. We know that our mission is bold. I often hear from people and they say to me, "How are you going to eliminate racism?" Yes, in that very tone. Well, it begins with forums like this. It begins with organizing and coming together for a common purpose. On August 3rd, 23 individuals in El Paso lost their lives because someone thought they were less than, because someone had been indoctrinated to believe that Mexicans were murderers, rapists, and invaders. Let's be clear. It was racism and hate speech that killed those children, mothers, daughters, sons, and fathers on August 3rd. Today, we come together to talk about the intersectionality of gun violence and racial injustice. Today, we gather with experts who will share their stories, their movements, and their work to promote policy reform that protects our communities, our children, our families, and our country. On the panel today are Otzi Vokiwa, Federal Affairs Director, Giffords, Courage to Fight Gun Violence; Gabby Diaz, State Membership Lead, Moms Demand Action; Christian Heine, Vice President of Policy for Brady; Mike De La Rocha, Co-Founder, Revolve Impact; Yulil Alonso Garza, teacher at Enrique Camanera Junior High School and member of the National Education Association. Welcome, panelists, and thanks for joining us. For our audience, please submit questions for the panelists in the question and answer section and any comments you have on chat. I'm going to jump into our first question. Each one of you has been affected by and made decisions to become active against gun violence. In that context, I'd like to begin by asking each of you to share with us what brought you to this work, and we'll begin with Otzi.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to CHCI and for having this conversation, and to you, Dr. Acosta, for moderating, and to all my fellow panelists. It's an honor to be with all of you. I think for me, I've always had an interest in nonprofit advocacy. I guess you can say I always kind of wanted to be a do-gooder. But I think all of us, unfortunately, have that moment when we realize that we're not immune to gun violence. For me, probably the first time it really hit me hard and felt personal was the Virginia Tech shooting. I was in college at the time and I was thinking about my career. And I just realized that even though mass shootings make up so much more of the narrative, as I learned more and more about gun violence, it has a disproportionate impact on Black and Brown people. So when I got the opportunity to become a part of the Giffords family and a part of this incredible community, I was really, really excited to kind of merge my passion for advocacy with an issue area where passing legislation or implementing a new program really means saving lives. So that's what motivates me and what motivates the team at Giffords. And it really is a pleasure to be having this conversation with all of you today.
Thank you. How about you, Gabby?
I just really want to echo Audrey, how incredible it is to be here on this super panel of activists and survivors. And just like you, I think I had moments where I was like, if I'm going to be a teacher, and I've been teaching public schools in Texas for 15 years, like I got to walk the walk, I got to walk the talk as a citizen. And I was a freshman when the Columbine shooting happened. And at that time we thought, oh, this was just an oddity. This was just something weird that happened in our society. And the first year I started teaching, we started practicing lockdown drills. They've changed a lot in 15 years. So certainly that side of gun violence had been a part of my life, just as a mother and as a teacher. But I had a student who was shot on his prom night, and he was just hanging out with his best friend. They were still wearing what they had worn to prom, and his best friend had to help keep him alive. Thankfully, to the doctors that end up cleaning the messes of failed policies, the doctors at Ben Cobb in Houston were able to save my student. But he will forever carry the scars of that experience, as will his best friend who had to keep him alive, as will his mother. And then last year, I had a student who actually murdered somebody else, a kid who I knew, who I really cared about. So the more I work for Moms Demand Action for Everytown, I realize the scope of this issue. I realize death by suicide by gun, domestic and intimate partner violence. The more I look around my society, I see that we just all have a calling and a responsibility.
Thank you. Christian?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the important question. I echo my fellow panelists' call. This is a really incredible group of people and representative of just amazing organizations doing life-saving work, and I'm just so honored to be here today. My name is Christian Heine. I'm the Vice President of Policy at Brady, one of the oldest gun violence prevention organizations that's been working in Washington, D.C. on a national scale. And for me, the question is an interesting one. How did I get here? How did I get in this role? I got into it, unfortunately, the way so many others have. In 2005, my parents had just returned from an amazing vacation together. They spent the weekend in Big Bear, California on the lake. They had borrowed a boat from my dad's best friend, and they'd just spent a couple days getting sunburnt and eating barbecue food and hanging out with the dogs, and just had a trip for the record books. And when they came back, they were returning the boat to my dad's best friend, and a gunman lay in wait to kill my dad's best friend. Because my parents were there, he turned the gun on them as well. And so when he walked up, he looked like he was going to give Steve a hug. My parents didn't really know what was going on, and he shot Steve, my dad's best friend, in the stomach. He then turned the gun on my dad, who was tying up loose ends on the boat, and shot my dad in the abdomen as well. This is about the moment that they realized what exactly had been happening. My dad either trying to run away to save his own life, or really to draw the gunman away from Steve and my mom. The gunman followed him, and my dad ran, and the gunman shot my father 2 more times. When he assumed that he could leave him for dead, he turned back around, and my mom hadn't run away. She had stayed to keep Steve alive. And from what we know from neighbors, the last words my mother ever spoke were her begging for her life before she ran about 10 steps and was shot and killed with a single bullet to the back. I think what is so remarkable about my story is that it's unremarkable. I think when I got involved in the movement, Brady was the place that I came to where I found my voice as a survivor. And what was horrifying to learn was that there have been so many voices, and particularly voices in communities of color historically that are disproportionately impacted by gun violence, that have been advocating for real and meaningful change for so long before this incident impacted my family. And what I learned in my work at Brady and at my work in the gun violence prevention movement is that we don't have a system of laws that any American can truly feel safe from gun violence. There is no community in America that can feel safe from gun violence, and unfortunately, there are too many communities that wear the burden and the brunt of the disproportionate impact of gun violence, simply because we don't invest enough in community. So I'm excited about this conversation. I think it's a vitally important conversation, and I'm just so honored to be among the incredible people here that are fighting to do just that, to prevent families from knowing the pain and trauma that I continue to go through, and my family continues to go through, and our community continues to go through, because we need to do better.
Christian, thank you for sharing such an incredibly personal story. It's just heartbreaking to hear, some of the stories that have brought you here. Mike, tell us about what brings you to this work.
Yeah, well, first I just want to echo what you said, Dr. Acosta, and I just want to take a moment to honor your family, Christian, honor your students, Gabby. It's stories that change hearts and minds, not so much facts, and I know that the pain is real, and so I just want to say from a loving place, thank you for sharing, and also that it's us that are going to help us get through this. So I just really want to honor you all courage for saying that. I got into this work because I've been blessed to be raised by two incredible parents, teachers. Father was instrumental in the Chicano movement of the 60s. And to be honest, it was just, my brother and I are one of just two men in my family that's never served time in a cage, whether it's a prison or jail or immigrant prison. I've seen the direct effects of poverty and violence on my personal family and understood the opportunities that I was granted that my cousins and uncles and aunts weren't, just drove me to get more involved. And so this is a real personal issue for me because I see how gun violence and state violence disproportionately impacts poor people and people of color in this country. And so that's what drives me to do what I do.
Thank you so much, Mike, for sharing that. Yulil, I know this is going to be a tough conversation for you, but can you share with us what brought you to this work?
First of all, I do, think about all the victims of gun violence and violence in general. But besides my resolve as a community organizer before our tragedy, is the DNA that's in my blood from my family to create change and to not settle and be working for the community. That's what my foundation in my life has been. But unfortunately, I'm also here as a mother whose son was murdered and was taken violently. And as a result of, instead of being reactive, I decided to be proactive. And it was because I didn't want another family member. And I hear what Christian and Gabby just, echoed. And what we don't want is to see others go through the pain that we're feeling on an everyday basis. Every morning I get up, I don't hear his voice. I can't say good morning. Every night I go to sleep, I can't go in and hug him and call him and FaceTime him. And so it was my promise to him and his life and the short life that he lived here that made me realize that everything that I had grown up with, the movements of the Chicano movement, just learning about it, the civil rights, and knowing that in a peaceful way, we can still create the action that we demand. And so as a mother telling the story in every space that I could, and that I was invited to, that I would find a space in, I made sure I told this story. And it was his story that began Mothers and Men Against Gangs Coalition. And it is that pink elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about. And one of the reasons that Matt is involved with gun, control is because it's one of the weapons that is mostly used in gang violence. It is easy, it is quick, and it hurts families, and it really resonates to other victims of violence and helping them find that resilience that we have received from our community. And one of the ways that I ended up here at this table here is because I ended up attending CTA Hispanic Caucus just by chance. I stumbled on it at a conference and got involved at the California Teachers Association with the Hispanic Caucus. But then they introduced me to the NEA, the National Education Association, and the Representative Assembly. And there is where I really saw the work with teachers. We are at the front line. We get to see our students more times sometimes than their own families. And so it was with that passion that I felt NEA's priorities, not just in prevention of violence, but making sure that what Mike and Etsy mentioned is we're a disparity in our race and in our cultures and the spaces of that we in minorities live. So I am so passionate to help move this gun control forward along with all of the panelists and NEA.
So we've heard just in this conversation how gun violence affects all people. It doesn't discriminate. Black, white, young, old. Those things don't matter when it comes to gun violence. But one of the things you just mentioned, Yulil, really has to do with race and gun violence. And oftentimes there's a racialization that occurs about gun violence. Gun violence occurring in a predominantly, or it's explained as predominantly areas that are people of color, brown, black people. Mike, you've done some work in this area. Could you talk to us about the racialization of gun violence?
Yeah. First, I would just like to honor the three black women, courageous black women that helped found the Black Lives Matter movement: Opal Tometi, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors. And I mentioned them by name because of their work and millions of folks across this country, we're actually having not just an honest conversation about race and power in America, but taking actual steps. And for me, violence has been the foundation of this country, whether we're talking about the genocide of indigenous people or the enslavement of Africans that were brought over. America's response to poverty and desperation has always been violence. And the only time that we get acknowledged as Latinos oftentimes is when there is a mass shooting. Like, this is what brought this conversation together, what happened in Paso. But the reality is mass shootings are only 1% of all the shootings with a gun in this country. And if you look at daily acts of violence, they're disproportionately in Black and brown communities, indigenous communities. And one thing that I always want to mention is that this is an issue of political will as well as an issue of priority. If Black and brown people were prioritizing this country, we know how to keep ourselves safe and healthy. We just don't prioritize that. And you look at the fact that more than double we spend both locally, statewide, and nationally on police, prisons, and judges than we do on community-based alternatives to violence, you could see where this is at. And so my hope for not just this conversation, but in moving forward, is that when we talk about this issue of gun violence, we acknowledge and state that police violence is gun violence. State violence is gun violence. In this time of George Floyd and countless Black and brown bodies being murdered in the street, we can't keep a blind eye anymore. We have to see those intersections. We have to see that, yes, universal background address poverty. We don't have access to resources that communities of color don't have access to. We won't get to the root causes of why we're having this conversation.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about George Floyd. Let's talk about the movement that has grown out of that moment in our history. Let's talk about, I really want to focus on that racialization of violence specifically in communities of color. I'd like to turn this over to Otzi. Can you talk to us a little bit about, and I'd like to share, actually, I want to hear from all of you. I want to know what your thoughts are on George Floyd. What's your thoughts on the current movement happening throughout our country to try to end not just gun violence, but violence against communities of color? So I'd like to start with you, Otzi.
Yeah, I think, it's been a really interesting few months in many, many ways. And I think the movement that we're having around racial reckoning and acknowledging police violence, the movement to change how police interact with communities is really, really important. I think one thing that has been a challenge, I think, in the broader gun violence prevention community is that we've often been reluctant to kind of acknowledge that police violence is gun violence. So I think it's been encouraging to see that change, to see more of our organizations standing up and recognizing that connection, and joining the voices and the communities and the people that Mike mentioned have been leading on this issue for years, in calling for a real change in the way that police interact with communities. I think one thing that I want to mention on this topic, just the broader racialization of gun violence, are stand your ground laws. I think that's something that we've seen really exacerbate violence, exacerbate systemic racism. These laws are now in 27 states, and they really remove the obligation that people have to kind of step back and de-escalate conflicts, and frankly, they incentivize violence. We know that organizations like the NRA have really backed these laws, while at the same time pushing to weaken laws surrounding the public carrying of firearms and also marketing firearms using fear-based tactics. So I think all of these phenomena happening together have really driven up violent incidents. And Stand Your Ground has had a huge impact by exacerbating a lot of the systemic racism that exists in the legal and justice system. So in states that have stand your ground laws, when there's been a white armed shooter, they are 350% more likely to be found to be justified in committing a killing if the victim is Black, as opposed to if the victim is white. There's also gender bias associated with stand your ground laws. In domestic violence incidents, if women use weapons to defend themselves against their abusers, they're much more likely to be convicted in states with stand your ground laws. So I think changing how police interact with communities, into adding in that layer of accountability, and also just to piggyback on what Mike was saying, to better invest in communities that have been historically underserved and redlined and segregated for decades. We also have to look at different laws that are on the books that exacerbate all of these problems that exist. And I think stand your ground laws are just one particularly important example to lift up of laws that we really need to get rid of, because they just do nothing but encourage violence.
Yulil, do you want to?
Yes, actually, it has been, an issue that has affected the whole community in the United States. I mean, nationwide. But I would like to actually thank the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, because of what the work that they've done to, deter guns from, the violence. But more than anything, they're also very proud of the fact that the House of Representatives passed the George Floyd Policing Act, 2020 HR, and that will definitely make a difference in how we level the field, and making sure that we let the communities know that they are cared for, that they're important, that we will start prioritizing what their demands are and what their needs are. Like Mike has and as Adzi has mentioned, I think it's really important that every life has meaning, whether, they're victims or they're suffering. And, I think it's important to understand that what happened to George Floyd is systemic. It wasn't just overnight that it happened. And we see that because before my son was murdered, there were several children murdered. And it wasn't until there was someone that was prepared to take on that challenge of demanding action that action occurred for a colored kid like my son Martin. And so we need to be that voice for George Floyd and for everyone that needs it.
Right. I've shared with you that I have a son who is, in his 30s. And when he was 17, we had to talk with him about making sure that he did not talk back, that he was very careful when he was stopped by a police officer. So we've all kind of felt that feeling, at least in communities of color. Gabby, you're with Moms Demand Action. And this is really coalesced, like this issue has really coalesced women, standing up against the violence because it's our children getting killed. It's our children being murdered. And so can you talk to us about the work that you're doing in mobilizing and getting active or getting other women and community members to become active? And is there an intergenerational process going on there?
Oh, absolutely. I would love to talk to you about that because it is a lot of women, but I gotta say we got a lot of guys standing with us. My dad, who is, he was born in Venezuela. I'm a first generation American, and my husband is a veteran, and they've got a man enough to be a mom shirt, and they're out there with us. So I just want to acknowledge all the tios and primos and like all of the guys, the hermanos that are standing with us. I roped my brother up in New York City. I was like, I don't care. You can get on a phone and phone bank with me, Diego. You've got like you can do a Spanish phone bank. So this last weekend, I had my brother in Seattle, my brother in New York City, my mom and dad. My daughter likes leaving the voicemails. So my second grader, Valentina, she puts on her fabulous voice and she talks to Texas voters. And she's like, please text Texas to 64433. And she's just adorable. But yeah, we made, in about 2 hours, we made 1,170 calls for Texas Congressional District 23 candidate Gina Ortiz Jones, a veteran, another member of the Hispanic community. She has an incredible story. So we're getting to work on the election, but I want to step back and say some of the most important work we do is with the Everytown Survivor Network, where we connect with survivors and we provide them with financial support, medical support, emotional support, legal support. My personal little tiny group out here in Houston, we're in Northeast Houston. We're kind of in the burbs, and there is an organization that's been doing the good work since the 1970s called Family Time, and they deal specifically with intimate partner and domestic partner violence. So we definitely like partnering with them. We partner with the Houston Peace Program. We have a program called Be Smart where we teach gun owners about how to secure their guns so that we can prevent suicide, so that we can prevent unintentional shootings. So like working with the community is what we do best. Guilting my family of all generations to get to work is what we do best. But it was incredible to have callers from all over Texas. Percy's from El Paso, Diana from Houston. We had Melanie from Austin. We had from San Antonio was Jen. I mean, just everybody doing the very first Spanish phone call, reaching moms that have long known, right? Like how many of us left countries of chaos and rampant gun violence, and we came here to be safe. And so we're going to continue fighting until we get that country.
I love, love, love your passion, and I'm so glad you're out there, fighting the good fight. Christian, I want to turn over to you because one of the things that I'm super interested in, I think, talking about is ghost guns, and I think you and I have talked about how intrigued I am by this idea, and also about the demand and supply side of gun violence, because oftentimes we just look at gun violence in communities of color. We don't talk about white supremacy, and we don't talk about gun violence as it relates to white supremacy. I know Brady's been working on this. Could you talk to us about that? And just to remind, if people want to ask questions, please put them in the question and answer dialogue box.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question and for the discussion. I mean, I want to acknowledge, I'm a white man who works for a historically white-led organization, and as so many have talked about on this panel, as a part of this national reckoning, I think our organization in particular has had to do not only a lot of thinking, but a lot of learning of folks who have been doing violence prevention work for a long time in communities of color, led by people of color. I hear the incredible work and the reforms that Mike is referring to, and everyone else here who's on this panel. Listening to people like Dante Berry, who did name that police violence as gun violence, right? Thinking through our own, theories of change at Brady that we have been bringing to preventing gun violence for decades. How many approaches historically are focused solely on the individuals pulling the trigger of a firearm, what kinds of disparate impacts potentially are adding to cycles of violence, and how can we get smarter and better? It starts with learning from the folks who have been advocating for these reforms for a long time. When we talk about police violence as gun violence, there's a lot that comes with that, especially for an organization like ours that takes these policy approaches. So, we've been doing our best to get to work to try to be supportive of policies that really deal with and look at how can we take structures and systems that were built in white supremacy, and how do we reform them or change them or tear them apart to build them back up so that we can really ensure that they are promoting racial justice. How do we think through the allocation and reallocation or authorization of when law enforcement should be called, or maybe when mental health providers need to be called, when crisis intervention teams need to have a back, and cities and communities themselves need funding to be able to do the work that maybe they're more appropriate to do than law enforcement in the first place. How do we mandate transparency to ensure that law enforcement can't go awry, and that we can really then hold them accountable? So Brady is in the midst of not only pushing policies and changes that we have been advocating for a long time, but we're also trying to really think hard and internally about what kind of advocacy has been done in this space for a long time, and how can we be good partners in lifting up those important voices and following suit. There's a lot of incredible work, especially, you look at the work that the Criminal Justice Action Fund is doing, right? And Mike and Amber's group to ask cities and states and the federal government to fund communities, invest in communities. There's no secret that the same reasons why communities are communities of color have exponentially high mortality rates due to COVID. It's the same reason why these communities, these root causes that Mike's talking about, need to be addressed so that we can tackle gun violence. We need to invest in communities, create opportunities so that we can have better systems, so that this violence is not cyclical. And Brady is ready to work on that. And we kind of think about that from the demand side, that if we are investing in communities, we can drive down the demand for why people are looking to pick up firearms in the first place. And in doing so, evidence shows us we can reduce gun violence. A complement to that we are incredibly excited about at Brady is to also think about the supply side. There are too many communities in this country where it is easier to find a firearm than it is to find fresh produce. how is it that guns are pouring into communities around this country unchecked? They're not growing on trees, right? We know that manufacturers make firearms, they send them to gun dealers. What is happening from that point of sale at the gun dealer that is making firearms so accessible and so readily accessible to communities, across this country, particularly communities of color? We aren't asking the question of where these guns are coming from. And we need to do a lot more to ensure that gun dealers are preventing those diversions of guns into the criminal market to begin with. So, I see these things as taking Brady's, our historic theory of change and trying to put that directly towards the problem. How do we tackle the supply side? How do we tackle the demand side? How do we have these things complement? If police violence is gun violence, what are the reforms that exist out there? Who are the people who have been really looking at this? How do we lift up their voices to make these changes possible? And how do we really let evidence, right, guide this discussion? And I think if we do that, ultimately, we will address this public health epidemic in a proactive way, and we will make sure that communities across the board and the communities most disproportionately impacted are safer, are healthier, and are stronger. And that is what we're trying to do over here, and luckily able to do it alongside of all the folks who are here.
Art and activism. And so the question goes like this: how do we change the gun-loving culture of the US? Do you think violent first-person shooter games and music with violent lyrics should be banned from sale?
Is that to me, Dr. Costa?
Yes, that's to you, Mike. Yeah, it goes to you.
I would like to just reframe it. Christian asked the question, like, we don't ask, how are these guns coming in the community? I'd actually say, the deeper question is, this whole system is not by accident, it's by design. And so, the question I always ask is, like, people know but don't want to ask the question, because that would have to have this reckoning that DC was talking about and everybody else, is that, like I mentioned earlier, our country was founded on violence, and we oftentimes point to particular cultural elements of people sharing their stories. Like, why is it easier for me to get a gun right now than it is for me to get a healthy produce, for example, right? And this is all connected. So when I think about it, it's like actually asking the questions of why are particular communities disproportionately impacted? Why particular communities don't have the same access and resources as other predominantly white communities, Even when I look at this field, and something I do want to acknowledge is, and I want to thank you, Christian, for those thoughts, about Brady as being one of the forefounders, I guess, of the current gun violence movement. As a person of color, as a Chicano, I need white allies to stand beside me and behind us. And when I look at the gun violence prevention field, historically has always been led by predominantly white, straight men. And that's the reason why I'm on the board of Community Justice Action Fund, because it was the first and now largest person of color led, person of color founded, person of color informed gun violence organization, because we've always lived multiple identities, multiple bodies. We've always lived these intersectional lives. And right now it's like white people are finally catching up, which I appreciate and we need. But like we said earlier, this issue is impacting all of us. So from a cultural standpoint, the question is, there are more guns now than people in America. And so we have to dig into the structural inequities and the structural racism that exists before, like, saying, hey, it's this particular music or video game. This is all symptoms of a larger root history and systemic kind of culture that we have here. And so, like I always say, like, there's victims on both sides of the gun, whether it's the survivor or the victim or the person that had the weapon, but they're all symptoms of a larger sickness in this American culture that we have that's based on violence. And so I guess, Dr. Costa, I'm always mindful of, like, broadening out the question, because it's easy to then start to blame particular artists or arts when it's like, there's a larger at play here on purpose that we need to start to dismantle.
Right. And I think it's also a cop-out. I know that, like, let's blame it on Let's blame it on the video games. Let's blame it on music. Let's blame it on, instead of really looking at what is the systematic issue that is occurring within our country that really is a racial justice or injustice issue happening in communities of color. But beyond that, it's social inequality. Whether you are white, black, brown, it's the fact that there are a lot of have-nots and very few haves, and they're having to struggle to try to make it through the day. And so they turn to often what is easiest for them to gain access to, which in some cases, and in a lot of cases, is through violent means. So it really is an institutional issue. It's a racial justice issue. It's an inequity issue. And I think you framed that just right, Mike. Kim from the audience asked, what role does the media have in this whole violence issue, in gun violence? Yulil, do you want to answer that question, or?
One of the things that I realized when our case was a high profile local case, I noticed that the cases before my son's had been played out very differently in the media. I'm an English teacher. I was a journalism co-editor. I was a journalism teacher, and so I had a different perception, and I knew that I couldn't allow the media to play out his case and the justice that we deserved and twist it and turn it into, this was the kid that was in the gang, this was the kid that was wearing the wrong colors, this was the kid that went into the wrong neighborhood, and tell the facts. Don't try to twist it and turn it. And that happens to our students. And we see that happening to our students. They're targeted, and sometimes their story is not told. A session earlier today with media mentioned, when we don't have reporters of color, or we don't have editors and producers of color in those rooms, then our stories only half told, and it's told from their point of view. I made sure as a mother, they were not going to mess with my son's story. And it's very important to empower our mothers, to empower our teachers, to raise their voice, and not just in that classroom, not just in their homes, but outside in their community and in the public. Because if we don't speak up, then they're not going to seek us out to hear us.
Right. Is there anybody else that wants to talk about this?
Yeah, I just was thinking while Yulil was talking, was recalling a story that I heard on the news the other day. It was coverage about the wildfires happening out on the West Coast. And the reporter was interviewing some folks who had stayed behind after their town had been evacuated to kind of try to protect their homes and that sort of thing. But what was interesting was some of the people that were being interviewed were talking about, well, in addition to wanting to save our homes from possibly being burned down, we also wanted to make sure that, looters didn't come and steal from us. And the reporter noted that all of the people who had stayed behind were openly carrying firearms. And it just really struck me that the gun lobby and the NRA has done such an incredible job. I have to give them credit where it's due, even though it hurts. They've done such a great job of driving this fear-based narrative that you need a gun to protect you, particularly racializing it, right? You need a gun to protect you from these others. Like, think about the narratives we're hearing about the suburbs in this election cycle. So I think, the media has a broader responsibility to push back on those narratives that frankly are false. They're not based in any evidence. They're based in a reality and driven by people who want to sell guns and who want to push narratives about people of color being scary and dangerous. And that's just simply not true. So that's something that happened even this week that just really came to mind as a narrative that I'm hearing over and over again that's incredibly dangerous and racist.
On that point, one of the things that I think is critically important for us to discuss is red flag laws, because people of color are painted as erratic or as violent or, all of these other, things come into mind. So let's talk about red flag laws and how many people of color end up being shot when the police is called to try to manage a situation where it is a mental health situation, where there is an issue where a person may not have their medication, but rather than taking a social worker or trying to de-escalate, often that escalates. Who would like to take that question about red flag laws and what we should be doing? Christian?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Well, look, I mean, I think all of these laws and those concerns are incredibly valid, right? Anytime we have a tool where it's law enforcement first, it is something that we need to be really mindful of and to keep a close eye. I think what is exciting about the extreme risk protection orders, which are and extreme risk laws, which are often called red flag laws, is that they're laws that were created to be based in evidence rather than and to push back on some of the red herrings that we often hear about. I mean, even the way that we talk about mental illness in this country and gun violence is oftentimes, when we talk about narratives that are incredibly dangerous, you are far more likely to be a victim of gun violence if you are living with a mental illness in this country than you are to be a perpetrator of violence, right? Mental illness on its own is only responsible or only attributed solely to a mental illness in about 4% of violent acts that occur in this country. So while we have to strive and have and should be fighting for access to mental health care across this country, to say that we need to prohibit individuals living with mental illness from guns, that's just simply not going to solve gun violence. We know that it'll only prevent like 4% of acts in this country. So what the extreme risk laws do is that they focus on behavioral risk factors, and intentionally it was created as a civil process rather than a criminal process, so that we're not creating new avenues of criminality, so that law enforcement aren't abusing a new tool that could throw more young Black men into prison. What they tried to create is a tool so that when people are displaying what we know to be risky behavior, right? There's no better predictor of future acts of violence than past acts of violence. They're drug and alcohol misuse. These kinds of things are what stack up and really show that somebody is at risk of harming themselves or others. We just want to get the firearm out of there. And these tools are based off of domestic violence orders, and they are designed to be a suicide prevention tool. So we certainly need our researchers, as they are at places like UC Davis, to make sure that there is not a disparate impact in communities of color, because these tools are attempting to sort of solve these myths of who is and who isn't dangerous, to just use a civil process so that family members can protect their loved ones. And thankfully, what we have seen in states where extreme risk laws are used and the research that we have seen around them is that they often are addressing and being used on individuals who are more likely to be die by suicide. So, in California, I think over 90% of respondents to those orders have been older white men. And frankly, that's the way we want to see these demographics play out. We'll keep a close eye. We need to make sure that we are not perpetuating tools that make cycles of violence worse. But we also need to, like these tools, look at the evidence, make sure we are not creating stigmas around communities who are already impacted disproportionately by gun violence, and make sure that we're addressing these issues as responsibly as we can.
Very well said, Christian. I'm so glad I turned that question over to you. I really appreciate all of the knowledge there. So we're getting ready to end this particular session, but before we do, I'd like to ask each one of you to share with us quickly, what is the one thing you would like to make sure that everyone takes away from this session? And Gabby, we'll start with you.
Thank you. Yes, I really can't stress enough that nobody's allowed to be an audience member here. Everybody has to take action. My favorite call the other day, I'm killing my poor plant over here, but my favorite call the other day was to this little grandma una abuelita Irma in El Paso, and I said, okay, Senora Irma, we've gone through your voting plan, and you know about Gina Ortiz Jones, and you know we start October 13th through October 30th. I said, but you would really help me if you could like tell your family. And she goes, oh my gosh, Gabby, my grandson just set up a little text group of 17 of us for the entire family. Let me text them right now Gina's number and when early voting starts. And we all, even if you're scared of phone banking for a candidate, don't be scared of picking up your phone and calling your family. Talk to your neighbors. Talk to that friend that left that one comment on Facebook that one time. But relational organizing works all the time because we pick up the phone for the people we love. So let's all get to work.
Beautiful. Adzi.
Yeah, I think my final note is I just want to say like how much of an honor it's been to be with all of you people. And I just wanted to say that it's really encouraging to see how intersectional the gun violence prevention movement has become. And what an honor it is to have people like you, Leal and Christian and Gabby, who bring such powerful personal stories to this movement. People like Mike, who take a broad look at all of the causal factors in society that have led to the gun violence that we see today. And not to toot my own horn, but like people like Christian and me who work on policy, like all of us add value. And it's so encouraging to see an organization like CHCI lifting up these voices and lifting up this issue. So as Gabby said, there are no bystanders here. We all have a part to play. And I think 2021 is going to be an interesting year for many, many reasons. But just want to encourage you all to think about this issue of gun violence, who represents your values, who represents the society and the communities that you want to see, and think about that as we head to the ballot box.
Okay, Mike.
First off, apologies for the light in my office going off. We're going to turn it on together as working together. I just want to say everything is local. And if we want to stop gun violence, invest in those closest to the pain, and the solutions are in our backyard.
Perfect. We have about a minute and a half. Lil?
Thank you very much. I'm here, as a mother, as a teacher, educator, community activist. And one thing that I will take away is work together, just like Mike said, with your local elected officials. Working with our Assemblyman Eduardo Garcia has really heightened our plan, our demands, and the work that we're doing with our community. And it made a difference that we had them come together. And so I tell you, work with, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus as well. They've done excellent work in establishing work with gun violence, and more importantly, make sure you take the courage to run for office, because I'm running for Imperial Valley College because I believe in every person can represent.
All right, you have about 30 seconds, Christian.
It's easy because everybody has already said everything that's important. I'm really am just going to repeat something that Mike said earlier in the same vein. Stories matter. If there's one thing that I know in this world, even when people haven't wanted to hear the story of my mom or the pain of having to move on in life without her, I couldn't take that as an answer. And I think what you see here is representative of that if you are able to share your lived experience with others, you can change hearts and minds. And that's what this whole game is about. So I'm just going to really repeat what Mike said at the very beginning, which is your story matters.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you to all of our panelists. Please keep tweeting about the conference CHCI HHM20. We encourage you to attend the sessions for the rest of the day today and the rest of the week. If you know anybody who's interested in the conference, encourage them to log in and register at chihhm.live. And also, please join our virtual gala celebration on Monday evening, September 21st, from 6 to 8 p.m. I want to thank all of you so much for being so wonderful and so thoughtful. And thanks to the audience that was there listening to us today. I am so glad our country is in the hands of so many vibrant and thought leaders. Thank you so very much for everything you do, and thank you for spending this hour with us. I am so thankful for your time. Thank you, and thanks to everybody else.
Thank you.